A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, welcome everybody. We're here today with Tom Rodgers. Tom Rodgers is a sociologist and criminologist working at the University of Sunderland, UK. He's interested in the commercial logics of the video game industry, specifically how the industry has experimented with and ethically justified methods of measurement and monetization, which is what we're talking about today. He's also published works on how video games offer up ethically exceptional experiences in the British Journal of Criminology, which is, Tom, you're definitely the first criminologist on this show. It's amazing the range of experts that we've had in this show, but criminology is not one I thought we would have. Of course, you're a sociologist as well, and this is probably fitting more into the sociology part, but that's still really cool because who would have thought that a journal of criminology would be talking about video games, right?
I mean, I am primarily a sociologist by trade, but for me, criminology is sort of a subfield of sociology, really. So I guess that's why I sort of say both. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's actually quite a few criminologists I know over here in the UK who've written quite a lot about video games, especially ethics of video games, and things like that.
We definitely want to talk afterwards to get more info on that. Okay?
Absolutely.
Tom is also the co-founder of the International Video Games Research Network Multiplay. Tom Rodgers, welcome to the show. Yeah!
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. And yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting topic that we've got to go through today. I'm looking forward to it.
And we've got a lot on here. Let me say to you listeners that this is a topic that could get technical. We're going to try to keep it as minimally technical as we can while getting to the issues the best we can. And I want to start with this. When we decided to do this episode, I posted a call out for this episode on Twitter. And I really had a misconception about what play to earn meant. I've heard the name thrown around a bunch. I thought it essentially just meant, all the different ways that you can make money playing video games, right? Beside officially being like a tester, let's say for a company. And from the responses that I got to my posts, a lot of other people also had misconceptions of what we were talking about, especially confusing it with pay to win and things like that. I thought that it would apply to any to being paid to play a game in order to populate that game with players to attract other players. One of my students and her family does that. That it would include playing a game that asks for permission to use your computer's processing power to mine for cryptocurrency in exchange for real world money. Wow, I thought that was innovative and interesting. Not that I would ever allow my processing power to be used this way. And that it would include the use of NFTs and blockchain technology, which is really what we're going to talk about in some way that would allow players to make money. So I guess, Tom, for starters, can you clarify for us what is exactly play to earn? What does it apply to? And how are players supposed to make money through playing? And we're going to get into that last part later on, but just the overall idea.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think you've highlighted something that's quite important actually to recognize is that play to earn as a general term in video gaming, it's been around a really long time. Actually, it's been around a very long time, like whether officially or unofficially. And there is a lot to be said about the unofficial going back even further, So I'm kind of just going to separate that out into two distinct categories, and we're obviously going to focus, I think, mostly in this episode on the latter category. But play to earn in general, we can go all the way back to something like World of Warcraft and the gold farming that took place in World of Warcraft. And, there's the rumors of, there being a very big kind of East and West service provision of Chinese players basically playing, 12, 13 hours a day in supposedly in sweatshops and mining this stuff and then selling it, or power leveling, which is a phenomenon where you can pay someone to level your character for you.
Right.
Off them. So in that sense, playing games in order to earn money which is the general term, has been around for a very long time in a lot of different forms, and I think in a way it's important to recognize that, because actually the industry has been very sensitive to the development by people outside of its official industry remit, by paying attention to what they're doing and actually starting to try and think of ways of adopting those ideas into the industry's commercial logic. And that's something that I did do a little bit of sort of thinking about in my PhD. But the second category, obviously, which we're talking about today, I would call, I kind of distinguish it and call it P2E, right? Which is kind of that's the industry term for this new revenue model that's being touted as kind of like the next key stage in video gaming history, I suppose, with all the hyperbole and stuff that goes along with it. And that's play to earn as a business model, right? Where it's very specifically a form of business model rather than a just a generic term for people being able to earn money whilst playing games. So I guess for me, it's like the deliberate building of a game around NFTs, non-fungible tokens. Yes, there's going to be a lot of acronyms today, but I think we can kind of keep those to a minimum as much as possible. Or blockchain-based content, basically, as a form of exchange that the game is built around from the ground up. Yeah, and that's what play to earn means at this current moment in the video game industry's history, when it's this is being touted as a really big potential development that people are going to supposedly be taking on board and developing games, like I said, from the ground up around. Going on to the next point you asked about it is, well, what is it? Is effectively in as many ways it's another way, or a new way really, for players to make money whilst playing games. But in particular, it's touted as being able to curtail the problem of ownership that's been around for a very long time when it comes to this kind of stuff, right? The idea of in-game content being always predominantly owned, or absolutely owned by the game company, is supposedly the bottom of that bucket falls out with this whole new model that's coming out, which is this play to earn mechanic built around cryptocurrencies. And the idea is that players will have the autonomy to buy and sell stuff that belongs to them, that they generate or create or earn within the game using blockchain technology, which is a form of exchange, market exchange, that is completely autonomous and anonymous. That's the idea, is that it's building on an already existing form of market to introduce it into game mechanics. And I think that's where the P2E model sits. One thing to bear in mind that this brings about, that I think conceptually is very interesting, is that this brings up one particular concept about the idea of the player investor as kind of like a new thing. That players are almost being seen as forms of investors now in a blockchain technology, rather than just like a player producer, which you've had in the past, people that create content within games. Now you have this idea of the player investor, and that's kind of the significant thing, I think, for the audience and for everyone interested in this stuff to think about, is that what's new about this is that it creates this new relationship between the player and the game, that they are a form of investor in its sort of ecosystem of market exchanges, because they're going to be predominantly trading cryptocurrency, basically.
Before we get into all the other questions we have, right, I want to make sure our listeners understand. Number one, this is supposed to be all about kind of a new kind of ownership. Can you explain a little something about what is the current, let's call it the classic model, the traditional model of ownership in video games? When I get something, when I get let's say a FIFA player in FIFA, do I own that player or not?
No, technically not.
Okay.
I mean, and
why not? I got it.
From a legal perspective, the intellectual property rights to that content is owned by the developer or distributor or whoever it is that has the rights to it. I mean, a great example, just to give you, is my Steam library, right? Because I play PC, is huge. I have hundreds, if not close to 1,000 games in my Steam library. I technically don't own any of them, actually. If Valve was to go bust, I don't have ownership of those games. It's all integrated into a platform that is completely and totally owned intellectual property-wise by them. And I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but in theory, if it was to happen, I wouldn't have access to those games anymore. I've paid for it as a form of service, if you know what I mean.
Right. And it should be also clear that Steam doesn't own those rights either. those games they have a license from those game publishers to publish on their platform. And so if one of those publishers goes down, the chain starts with the publisher and goes all the way to you.
Mm-hmm. And if the intermediary of Valve goes down, then there has to be a whole new way to access those games, which wouldn't necessarily be there, you know?
Right.
Now, this is clearly different than the games if you had the games on, let's say, CD-ROMs or something, right? Mm-hmm. Then you would own them, you can sell them. But, I could take my player from FIFA and I can, let's say, sell that player. How can I sell something? And we've had long history of buying and selling in video games. How can I sell things without owning them?
That's a very good question, and it's quite an intricate one as well, because I mentioned already before that the idea of play to earn's been around for a long time, and to be clear, things like gold farming that took place in World of Warcraft were entirely considered by games companies to be clandestine ventures. These weren't things that they endorsed, and actually they were technically by all rights illegal. But I mean, since then, and I mean even going back a little bit further, but since then, predominantly the games companies have experimented with and really fleshed out, and in many ways, like really, in some cases, really done it very, very well. They have created almost kind of their own markets where they actually get around some of that problem by either using an intermediary like PayPal, where you can use that to purchase in-game content, and then that in-game content can be bought and sold for real money within the game. Of course, but generally speaking, and this is only generally speaking, really, a lot of that transactional sort of behavior, or that market of exchange, usually only really takes place within that game. It's almost like it's a sovereign market in a way, if you think about it that way. Like I used to play a game called War Thunder, owned by Gaijin Entertainment, and they implemented a marketplace, and it was really interesting to look at because you pay real money. You can buy and sell tanks or planes from other players, and you use real money to do it. But once those items are in that market, they can't be taken out of it. They're still contained within the overall intellectual property right framework, I suppose, of the game world, if that makes sense. Right. So you can't take that tank, pull it out, and put it into another game or anything like that. I mean, that doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
It doesn't really make much sense.
Right. Well, it wouldn't do anything in the other worlds.
Exactly. And they used, for example, with Gaijin Entertainment, they created something called Gaijin Coin, which is their equivalent currency that you could exchange for real world currency in order to then make exchanges on their marketplace, if you see what I mean. So it's a way to bring real world money value into their marketplace, and then it's expressed in a token form by their currency that you then use to buy and sell games in their game economy. Right.
And that's very common in games now, to be able to buy. I mean, I can even go to the grocery store and buy cards for like Roblox. $10 I pay at the grocery store and take this card in, and it's got a code, and then I get $10 worth of coins, Roblox coins, whatever their coins are called. I forget.
Robux, yeah.
Robux, right.
Yeah, this is a really important point, actually, because I think it does clarify one of the other differences with NFTs being introduced, is that all of these things we've just been discussing now are about the creation of almost like a sovereign market with its own currency or token of currency within a game world that the game company have complete control and ownership over. Whereas with the introduction of the P2E or play to earn business model, the idea is that cryptocurrency should reconfigure that concept of ownership and the ability to have a market of exchange that can be outside of the game as well, that players will be able to, in theory, trade using cryptocurrency, meaning it doesn't have to simply just be related to one game. It's, in theory, can be related to any games that you can buy and sell this content. How that'll look in practice is still an open question, because I think ultimately actually a practical difficulty with that is, how do you take content from one game and make it valuable outside of that game? Because that's an issue I've not really seen many people discussing, but that's something that they tout, is that it doesn't matter where the exchange takes place, you can still make money from it. But if the game dies, so does all the content that's built in that game. So that's an ethical issue for us to consider, I think.
Right. So it seems to me that with this ownership thing, there's two issues. One is the sovereign market issue that you're talking about, where the item only exists, right, within the game, right, and you really can't take it out. And that's certainly a limitations of ownership. And if NFTs can change something about that, that's interesting. The other thing is that, as I understand, as you said earlier, you don't legally own the item in the game. So let's say the tanks that you were talking about, or the planes, right? You don't own them, but rather the game allows you to, if I had it right, the game allows you to use them. And even though you can buy and sell them, right, they're not really yours in the normal way we think of something being yours. Is that right?
Yeah. In the legal sense of private property ownership, yeah, they don't belong to me at all. They are not my sovereign property to do with as I wish. You know, I can't technically, a good example to kind of ratify that is that I can't, for example, legally speaking, take my War Thunder account, which has all my vehicles in it, and sell it to somebody else for real world money. Right? That's technically legal. People do it all the time. You know, there are marketplaces for that. You know, it's there, it's right there. People spy and sell game accounts.
But when you play the game, you sign a legal agreement saying that I'm really just leasing this and I'm not allowed to sell it to anybody else.
Absolutely. The end user license agreement of video games is the best way to get a sense of what we're talking about here, really. Actually, that's a very good point.
And like everyone, I've read it thoroughly and understood it completely.
Yeah, exactly.
I've read it thoroughly.
Yes.
I definitely read the Apple terms and conditions, yes.
So NFTs now come, and how do NFTs change the ownership aspect of this?
Because, I mean, NFTs are a form of crypto. Well, they're bound to cryptocurrency exchange, right? And we know from all of the hubbub around cryptocurrency in the last few years is that this is supposedly a revolutionary form of currency development and currency exchange, because anyone can own a portion of cryptocurrency. It's anonymized, and in theory, it can be exchanged anywhere on the blockchain for anywhere else on the blockchain, right? You know, there's this ability to have a form of, I guess it's not physical. I mean, you can actually buy physical bitcoins now. Apparently, I've not actually done it myself.
Really?
But, you know, the NFTs. Apparently, I don't know for certain, but I've heard rumor that you can buy these tokens that are supposed to represent portions of Bitcoin or something like this. But yeah, the NFTs changing all of this is that in-game content in a game that you say, you know, I don't know, let's just say Fortnite, for example, becomes fully NFT embedded, that a skin or a weapon that you earn, or that you, in some cases, in some games that you create, becomes linked to a portion of blockchain. You know, it has value on the blockchain, meaning that it can be bought and sold, in theory, outside of any kind of marketplace within the game itself. So someone could just say, I'll trade you this amount of money for that portion of cryptocurrency that is bound to your in-game item.
Now there is a specific market that allows you to do this. You have to go to a certain but there are a handful of them. They're competing.
Yes, there are. And I mean,
so it's like the the New York Stock Exchange versus the Nikkei Stock Exchange.
Yeah, exactly. The interesting thing for me is when you ask, so how are the game companies still making money from this? Is, you know, that they take a slice of every exchange that takes place. That's still the same case in every example. Right.
Like, and Counter-Strike Go, you know, people can create their own markets. We actually had a student who did this. He made a fair bit of money creating a Counter-Strike Go server that was a marketplace for people to buy and sell Counter-Strike Go skins and weapons and whatnot. And
it's a self-contained server that he ran, yeah?
That's right. And he took a piece of every sale that went through his marketplace.
And did he have to negotiate that with Valve? Is it Valve that owned Counter-Strike?
I can't remember. I don't know. I don't know whether it was something that he, or whether it's something that's part of the general license.
Could be.
Or I don't, that part of it I don't know.
But
it'd be interesting to find out.
But the idea is the same, right? I mean, you take a piece of the action as people buy and sell. And with the blockchain, you could actually do it outside of the game. And that's supposed to have advantages. So let's, before we get to the advantages, really quick, how widespread is this? There's so much talk about NFTs and blockchain and Web 3.0. Is it mostly just hype, or is this technology being widely adapted by game companies?
It's both. And I'll kind of clarify what I mean by that. I think it's very interesting to see this particular moment, because there are actually a lot of games that are built on NFT blockchain exchange. I mean, you've got examples that aren't necessarily what you can traditionally call like AAA titles yet, made by the really big developers. But you've got games like what's it called? Guardians, Galaxy of Guardians, or Guild of Guardians, or something like that. We've got one called Axie Infinity, which is a really interesting case in point because it actually was, I think, it was hacked in some way, shape, or form, and a load of the in-game cryptocurrency was taken by a hacking group. You've got other games like Gods Unchained. These are like, but the interesting thing about them, and the reason why I said both, really, is because a lot of these games that are built on NFTs are kind of like we're almost at like the experimental stage here in the video games industry, where you have got these games emerging, and whether they're the products of subsidiaries of really big games publishers or they're from smaller publishers who are trying to make a name for themselves, jumping on a new technology to see if they can have like another Candy Crush Saga moment, is difficult to say exactly. But the reason why I said both is because these games are emerging in smaller forms, but then the really big publishers are keeping a watchful eye. That's how I can see it at the moment, is that you've got declarations from companies like EA that they're interested, and they are sort of experimenting with the integration of this stuff, but it's not become a full-blown, guaranteed way to take the industry in a new direction yet, because let's say the big players are still thinking about it, and they're watching what's happening, which is a very interesting thing to happen. I think that happened a lot with the free-to-play model too, in a lot of ways. It did take more time for companies like EA, Activision, Blizzard to adopt the free-to-play model fully into their game design from the ground up, because they were looking at the success of the mobile market for a few years first to see if this really is a good direction to go in, you know?
Though the success with free-to-play, the attraction of free-to-play is obvious. It's literally, I mean, you know, it's literally there in the title. It's free, right? And this will bring in tons more players. I guess the same is the...
And it did.
It did, right? Is play to earn? I mean, play to earn is also pitched as good for players. Is it also just in the title? How is this supposed to actually be this revolutionary, incredibly enticing? What's the pitch here?
I mean, the pitch is quite simple, and it's not a new pitch at all. In many ways, it's that everyone can make money from this. It's a win-win, right? You, as an average everyday player, can just play the game, gain items in the game as you play, and the more time you spend in the game, the more items you'll accumulate, or say the more XP you'll accumulate, the more powerful your character will become, and have a sort of a melange of things that can be bought and sold and traded. In some of them, you can actually create things that could become extremely valuable given how they would be viewed within the gaming world, whatever, and that those can be bought and sold for real world cash if you want to cash out, and that in effect is kind of like the pitch, is that you can make money from this. And it's very, very similar. In my opinion, a lot of the rhetoric and everything like that is very much just echoing a lot of the rhetoric you see around blockchain currencies more generally, which is that everyone can make money from this. So what's not to like, right? Everyone can get a slice of the pie. That to me is the pitch for this at the moment that you see in the media.
But it's so strange because you can already do that in games that do not require blockchain technology. So what's new about this?
I think what's touted as being new is that it's now basically much more seamless and easy to cash out and get real money for what you've been doing in the game, rather than having to go through, say, an intermediary market where, technically speaking, you might not be able to actually get real world cash for this, but you can in a lot of games still earn in-game currency and exchange that for other things, or pay real world money, or even get real world money bought into the market. Do you see what I mean? It's supposedly going to make it more seamless for you to cash out.
But that student of ours was doing all of this on CSGO.
Yes.
And other people were coming and selling things for real money to other players.
I think if we think about that for a second, it's a matter of scale and a matter of economy. This is I mean, if we took what your student did with Counter-Strike, it's brilliant and genius, but doing it that way on a mass scale would require a lot of technical architecture, like people managing the market, people maintaining the servers, and also managing this market of exchange, and actually in a lot of ways having a lot of power over a market of exchange. The touted difference with NFTs is that the blockchain is going to be doing all of this for us, because it's this amazing new revolutionary technology in inverted commas, that that basically automates exchange and anonymizes it, and it's completely decentralized. There is no one authoritative power that supposedly controls cryptocurrencies. That's the idea here, right?
And what's the benefit of not having not having an authority in charge here? I mean, if we're talking about FIFA, then the authority would be EA, let's say, right? In a FIFA marketplace, right? For CS:GO, let's say it is Valve. If Valve makes, I think they do. If they make
think
CS:GO,
it might be.
right?
I know what you're talking about.
Right. So what's going to be here? This big benefit of decentralization.
I have difficulty seeing what it is, actually. I have quite a lot of difficulty seeing what the real benefit is, because I still have quite a lot of difficulty in seeing the real benefit of what decentralized cryptocurrencies are more generally, actually. I still am skeptical about the idea that there's no significant powerful actors here that actually have control over a lot of this stuff, because I am a bit of a cynic, and I do think that where there's sort of a vacuum, power fills it, and that's kind of a bit generalized. But I think someone like Elon Musk is a very interesting person to keep an eye on with relation to cryptocurrencies and Twitter and the kind of the almost like the manufacturing of sentiment around confidence in this kind of stuff. That's how stock markets work. I think in a way that's a lot of how cryptocurrencies work too. But the supposed benefit to this being decentralized and not having a power authority like, say, FIFA in control of all of it, is that it is more seamless and more easy for you as a player, supposedly, to sit down, play the game for a few hours, generate a load of in-game content, and then without having to go through a mediary market with FIFA directly, you can just sell it on the blockchain. I.e., you could sell it to someone who's not even interested in the game that you're playing, and to them, it will still apparently have value as a portion of cryptocurrency. Do you see what I mean? So it kind of makes the idea, I suppose, is that it makes the availability of buying and selling in-game items open to everyone, even if you're not a gamer, which makes it really like appealing to gamers, because it means anyone can buy what I'm generating here. Like, right. So what? It's like buying a copy of the Mona Lisa because apparently it's unique because it's a non-fungible token. And I'm just going to have that sitting in my bank account. And at some point, the value of that in-game item might go up. And all I am as a person is just a cryptocurrency trader. I don't play this game, but I've bought this in-game item from this person that generated it. And I'm keeping a close eye on that game economy. It's going up. I'm going to buy a load of NFTs from that in-game economy and then sell them later on. Like I think that's one of the ideas. But again, that's not necessarily always very clearly communicated to people, I don't think.
Is it akin to basically the way people invest in the art market? Like investors buy valuable paintings and in the hopes that they will become more valuable later on.
I think that's a hope. That is a hope of how it could turn out, for it to be a very profitable form of market exchange based around gaming. I think that analogy I've seen used quite a few times as a very sort of like hopeful idea that, hey, it could become like this, because I mean the art industry and the buying and selling of art, we're talking millions, sometimes multi-millions, hundreds of millions of dollars for just one thing here.
It's absolutely something that happens at the very tip top of our economic spectrum, right? It's not something that happens for everybody. And this is supposed to be this sort of libertarian dream of everybody can be involved in this. Everybody, with $5, you can invest and you can make money this way.
Yep.
And I will say that as someone who has never used any of these kind of exchanges like the CS:GO exchange that you were talking about, Andy, if it was built into the game that my in-game asset was already on a marketplace that anyone can view as, as actually worth real money, that sounds awesome to me. Now, I mean, having said that, certainly there seems to be an obvious difference between the art world and the game world in that, as you said earlier, if the game shuts down, this is not worth a damn thing. All right. Where, the artwork can hang on any wall and still be, the artwork. Here you've got these virtual items that are built into virtual worlds. And I'm assuming then the pitch for the company, the goal for the company here is that the company gets to get... So as far as I understand, so you said the company gets a share of essentially the exchanges. Again, how is that different than a normal share in a marketplace of exchanges, unless the idea is that players will be more motivated to exchange, so the volume will be higher, so the companies will make a little more money because of the volume.
You've absolutely hit the nail on the head there for me. I think
I got it. All right, finally. All right.
Ultimately for me, I think what this really is, and I think we've kind of said it in as quite a few different ways already, is that this isn't actually completely new. It is, in a sense, a form of bandwagon, right? In a sense, and I mean, there's actually quite a few ways that people can see this as a bandwagon, but the way you've just sort of suggested there is exactly what I think it is, which is what the most valuable thing, right? And I'm predominantly interested in theories of value and where value comes from, right? Not just money, but value more generally, like what is the value of a person and so on. The most valuable thing to any video game company is attention. It's attention. It's people. It's people, not necessarily their wallets straight away, but it's people and the attention that they can garner from it. That's why, some of the key metrics in the video games industry, no matter what game you're designing, are things like retention, player acquisition. You've got things like added value from player activity. You've got lots of quite technical terms. I mean, I've got books on monetizing games, and you look at it, and it's just full of these acronyms for all the kinds of things I just mentioned there about how do you retain players, how do you identify players who are likely to introduce new players to the game, and the metric score for that is usually referred to as their virality, like how viral are they as a player to introduce new paying customers. Very sophisticated metrics actually, but that's the key point, is that it's attention. And what you said, like the simple way to see it really, ultimately for me, in a similar way to how cryptocurrencies are talked about, is the more people that get involved in this, the more money it will make. Right? It's about garnering interest. And I think you hit the second nail on the head straight afterwards as well, about this will encourage, in a way, if you think about it on a macro scale of activity here, it will encourage more people to engage in exchange. And the more people engaging in exchange, the more of that little slice of every exchange that takes place goes back to the games company. So it is potentially a massive gold bag. I think gold rushes are a good way to think about this, actually. I think in a way, I mentioned before we started the podcast that I'm very interested in the concept of gold rushes and going back historically. But yeah, the internet seems to have a lot of gold rush mechanics built around it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. I want to compare this a little bit with the stock market. When you buy a share of a company, you buy it through a stock market, and the stock market gets, they make money because people are selling things in their marketplace. And when you buy it in an initial public offering, you're buying it from the company. And after that, you're just buying and selling stocks to other people, and the company doesn't make anything at all from it. They make it indirectly in the sense that whatever their stock is being purchased at gives their company value, and the value is what they use when they go to the banks and ask for loans. And so they make money indirectly through borrowing power as the stock price goes up. But the way these NFTs seem to work, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you buy an NFT and there's this contract, and the contract says that when I buy and sell this NFT, now that it's once I bought it from the initial company, they've made their money that way. Now I can buy and sell it on the open market, but they still get a little portion of that sale.
Absolutely.
So this is this is different from the stock market.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, in the way that you've pointed out there, that there's, from my understanding, and there may be alternative ways to doing this too, but my understanding of the prevailing way that this model is being kind of thought about and developed is that intermediary relation of the original sort of platform owners, I suppose, if you want to call it that, get a little slice of the pie each time the pie changes hands. Right? We're thinking about a pie that's changed hands 10, 20 times, whatever, it doesn't matter. Still getting a little slice of that is absolutely how it will work, in at least as far as my understanding. And so that is quite different to the stock market, like you say.
Is there anything wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with it, except that the reason it doesn't work like that in the stock market is because it is a drag on the amount. Because if you think, like, if it's 1%, then that means that when I sell it and let's say it's gone up 10%, I'm actually only getting 9% of my profits, because I'm giving away a percent to the company every time. The stock market doesn't work that way for a very good reason, because it's a drag on the stock market. It's a drag on people actually buying and selling stuff.
Yeah, it creates a drag effect on the speed and the amount at which things move. And if there's one thing about the stock market that it relies on, it's stuff moving. It needs to be moving. Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that plays into that, and this is a way in which it is, I think, going to be similar to the stock market, is all to do with confidence. And I mentioned before some of the key metrics that the games industry use to understand the projected value of their game. You know, think of it like a stock. You know, a company that's put their IPO on the stock market, and they, you know, the amount of players, the retention, and all these things go into projected values of what the game's going to look like and how much money it's potentially going to make. But just like with the stock market, and in a way, I think also with cryptocurrencies, confidence is everything. And when confidence starts to drop, activity starts to drop. You know, think of the parallels here between people buying and selling on the stock market and people engaging with each other and playing in a game. The more that activity goes down, the worse it gets. And then you reach stagnation, then you reach crisis, then you reach crash, then you reach liquidation, you know, like gone. And that therein lies kind of one of the big ethical rubs, I think, for what we're talking about today is this isn't technically really anything completely new. There are new facets to it, I suppose. But from an ethical point of view, you've got to ask questions about, you know, what's it going to look like for players who have invested great amounts of time and effort in a particular game? And usually, generally speaking, if you want to be one of the really big players, probably as a player earner, you got to get in there early, right? And getting in there early comes with risks, because as we know, we hear a lot about the success stories of games built on this kind of stuff, and we will do in the coming years. But we often don't get a lot of attention paid to the failures unless there's something spectacular. You know, and like it's going to be risky. It's going to be very precarious for people trying to get into this as a form of making a living. There's no employment rights. There's no nothing to protect you. You invest a load of money in this, and the game company mismanages the game, and it all crashes. The games company aren't going to be liable to pay you back.
It's interesting because we spent a big chunk of this episode setting things up, right?
Yes, of course.
So we understand what we're talking about, and when we look at it from an ethical perspective, there's so many different directions we can go in. Starting with this idea that you've got this, you know, traditional category of someone who's a player. And, you know, a player is something you do from a very young age, and it's fun and it's not serious. But now all of a sudden, the same person is an investor. And investing is very adult, very serious. There's a lot at stake. The first thing that I'm really wondering here is, from everything I understand, what Andy's told me, our game design department thinks this is mostly hype and bullshit. But
I'm mostly in agreement. I'm mostly in agreement there.
but you know, to be honest, I mean, I've heard enough for me to think, okay, there are some pretty interesting stuff out here that could grab me, where I do see some potential advantages here. But you know, it's not simple to understand. And, you know, mind you, investment is not simple to understand. I mean, some of us just invest in the stock market in very kind of broad ways, but most of us don't jump into the stock market like I did in 1999 when eToys crashed and Amazon crashed and I lost all my student loan money. You know, which I invested because the bubble was going up, right? Everybody was making money. But, you know, I mean, that's really, when you put that in a video game context, most players are playing a game. And if it happens that also their in-game assets are now worth something, that sounds great. But once you kind of turn it into investment, the line between player and investor seems to me potentially get very blurry, and the potential for manipulation, deception, any kind of practices that encourage me to invest without really understanding what I'm doing seem to be like a real dangerous thing. And, you know,
investors are one population of people, players are a very different population of people. And I'm not sure how well those two populations mix. I'm curious what you guys think about that.
I think it's really astute to point out this idea that we're actually starting to. We've talked about all of this stuff, and we haven't really talked about what it is to play a game and what games actually are to us, and the ethics that are thrown up by the introduction of this almost like sort of colliding of almost sort of like, stock market exchange type kind of dynamics with regards to investment and so on, and play as a part of our social life that for most people is supposed to be about your downtime or whatever, or in some cases, it's a bit more than that. It's quite serious and it's solemn in its own way. It's not just tumultuous play and having a bit of fun. Sometimes it's actually quite organized and heavily structured, and you've got people that rely on you and that you rely on them, and it's like a cohesive activity or something like this, or a competition, because competitions can be serious even in a game context. But
very much.
But the investment side, and like you say, investing, becoming so almost like a part of playing games is definitely throwing up a lot of questions, and I think it will throw up a lot of questions in the future too. I think you mentioned this idea of there being almost kind of like deception, problems, potentially if you don't know how a lot of this stuff works, or if there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that no one is really privy to, which I do think happens with cryptocurrency. That's my opinion, but that I do think that does happen with cryptocurrency. And I think that directly will affect play-to-earn gaming if it uses cryptocurrency as its base format. Then, that is very ethically troubling because, I remember a few months ago when supposedly, and I know it's supposedly because it's quite controversial at the moment, that Elon Musk supposedly endorsed this new algorithm or AI, quantum AI, I think it was called, or something like that. It was some new program that anyone can use to make money off Bitcoin, because everyone can make money off Bitcoin, no matter who you are. That every single person in the world can make money from it. And I mean, ultimately, the stock market and cryptocurrencies don't work like that. There has to be winners and losers.
Right, of course.
There has to be. That's the whole point of it, right? But it was very controversial. I mean, I think he's publicly said maybe that he didn't endorse it, or there's some kind of controversy around it. But the simple fact is what you've pointed out is here, that someone was trying to exploit the idea that this is a win-win for everybody when it clearly isn't going to be. It's a bandwagon where they want many people just throwing in a few $5 here, $5 there, $20, maybe someone puts in $100, but add all of that up, and those people aren't necessarily going to make any serious money off that at all, but add all of that up, and that's a heck of a lot of money that's going to increase the value of whatever cryptocurrency it is that's been started up with that idea in mind.
I have to say that I have received and taken probably 6 or 7 meetings this summer from companies wanting to gamify their NFT, cryptocurrency 3.0, Web 3.0 business.
So you're saying not that they want to do a game, not that they want to add this to their game, but they want to take the business and gamify it.
Well, they in some cases they want to create a game, and in some cases they want to gamify the business. It's variations of things, and I haven't taken any of these jobs yet, although the conversation I had this morning was intriguing, because there's a saying, right, that if you don't know who the rube is, it's probably you. And I haven't been able to figure out who the rube is in these things because of these promises. Right?
Now, mind you, the designer is probably not the rube, but the player could
right.
easily
I'll get a paycheck and it'll be great.
Right.
But I also, as a host of a podcast called Ethics in Video Games, I don't necessarily want to take that paycheck if it's going to lead to some ethical problems.
In some cases, these NFT-based games do require a prior investment before the player can begin playing the game. That's one other way that an initial offering is made. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know how popular that will necessarily become as the base model for it, but that is the case. And, one of the games I mentioned earlier, Axie Infinity, that game, the one that was hacked, there were a lot of people who had already, I mean, this is sort of in the news, so I don't know the actual figures, had invested a lot of time and effort in in building up their NFT base in that game. You know, the things that they have that are worth real world money, and all of the value of those are gone because that game was hacked. I think about 600 million odd was I think I've got the article here somewhere actually. About $600 million, I think, worth of stuff was taken.
Wow.
Right. And if this was a real security, there would be giant lawsuits.
Here you go. The Lazarus hacker group supposedly hacked the Ethereum-linked side chain of the blockchain that was linked to the game. About $600 million was stolen, I think. But I mean, the result of that for the game was that the in-game economy just completely tanked. Activity went down, confidence went down, everything went down. So people's assets became worthless, you know? So,
and you don't get something like this in the stock market, I'm assuming. I mean, you can at least nothing direct like this, and you have some legal protections for the stock market, right? Are there any legal protections that players would have, right? Or player investors, if we're all player investors now, would they be aware of it? You know, I have another example. Speaking of kind of coming in, I was looking at one of the games you mentioned before. I think it was Gods Unchained. And from what I understand, there's two things there. One was the idea of a fair launch that I wanted you, if you could talk about that. But another one, it seemed to me that the whole thing was set up as a sort of a pyramid scheme of some kind, where essentially you were told buy land. In the world, right? It's going to be worth a lot of money. You want to buy land, and the more land that people buy, the more your land is actually worth something. And the more you can get people to buy more land, it's worth more. And to me, this just seemed like you're setting yourself up for some sort of pyramid scheme where the value is determined by how many other people have confidence that this has any kind of value. And the minute people decide, you know, that the people above them aren't going to have any confidence in it, the whole bubble bursts. And
it's a Dutch tulip craze.
Right? Sure, a Dutch tulip craze. Sure, whatever kind of, you know, bubble you want to call it. And I think, again, it wasn't clear that investor or the player would understand these sorts of things, and especially in a game context.
Right, you know, if the idea here is that this is for everyone to make money and this is a win-win for everybody, you do have to ask the question of, but who, you know, in a world where sort of it is implicit in almost everything that kind of, I guess, capitalism throws at us, is that there are winners and losers, right? There always will be. That's how it works at the moment. That is how it's always worked. Who are the winners and the losers here? Who are going to be the winners and the losers? You know, that to me ultimately is kind of what some of the things you just mentioned there throw up as a question. And I think there's the potential for a lot of people who invest in this from the bottom up, both in terms of time and in terms of money. Because I mean, don't forget, like a player's time is really valuable too to a person. You know, investing a lot of time and effort in something is really significant. You know, it's linked to well-being. It's linked to lifestyle. It's you know, I see all these sort of discussions about Twitch streamers, for example, who basically work themselves to death for about 4 or 5 years, and it's to stay ahead of the game. It's to be a winner, and they almost kill themselves doing it. I personally think that this whole system of game development and monetization strategy has the potential to inculcate that in players too. People who want to be on top of the game will work themselves really hard for this, you know, way beyond what we would call sort of, you know, like regulated working hours for earning a living, you know?
Right. And in general too, there's a real psychological issue with taking something that people normally have intrinsic motivation to do. Play a game, it's intrinsically motivating. It's fun to do, so I do it. And adding an extrinsic motivation to it, like money. And what happens is, and this has been psychologically proven, that extrinsic, that reward, that extrinsic thing, erodes your intrinsic motivation over time. And so the thing that you like doing, just because you're getting paid for it now, becomes something over time that you like less and less and less and less to do.
And if this is just to add to this, and if this is true, because this gets into something you mentioned earlier, Tom. Does this mean that adding this to games is essentially also potentially ruining games? And when I think of ruining games sounds like this big moral panic.
Dramatic, right? Yeah.
It's very dramatic. But to go back to this value thing, right? You're taking something that's of enormous value to billions of people. And you are essentially potentially undermining that value by changing the motivation involved in it so that it's no longer really enjoyable. And instead, potentially, we have people on a treadmill that is looking for how to recoup their investment or grow their portfolio instead of all the intrinsic fun of playing games that we have, and that maybe there's something wrong with just doing that.
Yeah, I think there's two dimensions to that I want to speak to actually. One from the development side and developers and what their mindset is going to be, and one from the player side and their kind of mindset. I'll do the second one first. Like my personal sort of take is there's that is an issue. This idea of kind of the almost sort of the decaying of games as something that's fun and interesting in the individual's mind and collectively, on a social level in people's interest, is fascinating. And I've thought about this. And I mean, as I get older and I get a bit longer in the tooth year by year, and I look back on my gaming life as a kid, I didn't really watch TV much when I was a kid. I had a SNES, then I had a PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2. That was me. That was my childhood, right? And I think I remember in the early and mid 2010s picking up my mobile phone and starting to download some of these free-to-play games that I was also studying at the time, because I was really interested in actually the moral panic at that time around the free-to-play model, and thinking about, well, what are the implications of this for me and also more widely, sort of from a political, economic and a social point of view. And I just found them so boring. Because I would play for 5-10 minutes or a day or so and be like, actually this is really cool, and then the mechanics would kick in where it becomes incredibly difficult to progress unless you start paying small amounts of money regularly. Was the thing that I noticed. It would ask you to on some of them I'd be asked to pay 99 pence or cents in order to take another turn, or I have to wait 30 minutes before I can take my next turn, kind of thing. It's sort of these mechanics that the game was clearly built around from the ground up. It wasn't that it was an amazing gaming experience that had been built and then these mechanics had been introduced to kind of cordon parts of it off. I found these mechanics very boring, and I think a really nice word that I can use to describe it is from a German sociologist from a very long time ago now, who was observing what he thought was kind of one of the main things that modern bureaucracy and the modern form of capitalism was bringing about, is that it was very disenchanting. The enchantment of playing a video game, for me as a kid when I was playing Mario, or even a bit later on, even games like Dark Souls, which I'm a massive fan of, by the way. I love those games, but it's interesting to me that Dark Souls is a bit of an exception to the norm now, actually, and that's one of the reasons why it was so successful. But to me, it tapped into something I remember from when I was a kid. Games are really hard, really rewarding because they're hard, and there's a lot to be done, and they're beautifully crafted, and you can tell that they're crafted with love. Yeah, mm-hmm. you can tell that whoever sat down to come up with this is a world builder, whether it's Mario or Dark Souls, right? And I remember thinking that all these mobile games that I was playing didn't feel like they had that almost sort of labor of love put into them to kind of captivate me as a player into what it is that they're offering, whether that's Candy Crush Saga, which is beautiful in its own way, but the mechanics really impeded a lot for me. It just didn't feel like. I mean, there were some exceptions. I loved Plants vs. Zombies. I thought that was a great game when it first came out. I thought it was actually a really good labor of love, that game. I could tell that the developers had really created this really interesting idea and built it, and it was beautiful. But I remember thinking that, more and more, these kinds of games are very disenchanting for me. And I think that's in relation to free-to-play. And I just have this sort of thought in the back of my head when it comes to the introduction of NFTs and this cryptocurrency model of introducing the player investor and the almost like the beefing up and bloating of the ability for players to transaction and exchange real world money even more and the merging of that with in-game items is just, what's that going to mean for what it's like to play one of those games? Because if we flip over to the second dimension of what I was going to say, which is developers, it's clear that it's not the case that new ways of making money are simply just taking something that already exists and then just turning it into a way to monetize it. Because that does happen. But when you have a new model like this, it inevitably influences game design from the ground up. And I think if there's one thing about video games that I think, in 300-400 years' time, if humans are still around, video games will be looked back on from when I was a kid, from the 70s, 80s, well, the 80s and 90s in particular for me, but, even the 70s as well, as the birth of almost like an entirely new art form, because they are art, right? In my opinion, I think there are many other things as well, but video games are a form of art, and I include in that definition the art of seduction. Video games are meant to be very seductive. They're meant to pull you in. They're meant to make you forget about the real world for a little while. But playing video games, either the free-to-play model to, sort of be encountered every 5 minutes with, you need to pay real money to continue, or whatever, that kind of breaks that enchantment for me. I'm sure it does for others too. I'm sure for younger people, for younger generations, it might not be the case, but I do definitely think that there's something about the disenchantment of this going on. And I can't really put my finger on it exactly, but disenchantment is the word that I'm kind of sticking with right now. And I wonder if also game developers, especially, I would be really interested to talk to game developers who have been in the industry for a very long time, what their views are on this, and whether they think that it's actually quite disenchanting, and that, the kinds of things that they foresee game development being is far more sort of overly rationalized into a monetary logic, rather than a logic of, here's how you make a beautiful game that's an expression of your creative abilities. To me, that actually is an ethical issue about the ethics of the value of art and creative practice, really, at the end of the day. How rewarding is it going to be in 20 years' time to be a game developer, or you do an undergraduate university course first on games development, where the primary thing that's drummed into you from the start is cryptocurrencies. You got to understand those. Then you also need to understand how to set up a market, and then you can build your game around these things, right? How enchanting is it going to be for someone who has the creative impulse to a dream of, I want to make the next Dark Souls, but actually even their education in games development is going to be framed almost entirely by commercial logics first and artistic practice second. That's what happens when, like. And this is kind of what Max Weber, more than 150 years ago said, is that at some point, commerce and commercial logic disenchants the world. It can come to dominate so much that money no longer becomes like a means to an end; it becomes an end in itself. Is kind of what he gets at, and I almost see that seeping into game design slowly, drip by drip. That it becomes a bit too transparent, and that's the disenchantment that I'm talking about. I mean, I feel like I've talked a lot there to the two kind of sides, so I feel like we need another question or for some comments on it.
We need to hear from you, Andy. So I mean, to partly, and it's great, Tom, that I thought that was beautiful said, and I definitely share that. And notice we're talking about for both developers and players. And I would extend that to just beside an art form, just a human experience, right? That has so much value, and there's some sort of responsibility in not undermining that value. Andy, as the kind of developer he was talking about, have you seen like an actual shift in the way that, especially since free to play came along and the possibility came along, that went in this direction?
So first off, your statement about these mechanics being built in from the ground up is absolutely correct. That is exactly the way that those things have to work. When you make a game, it is a commercial endeavor. You have a one sheet at the very beginning that says, here's what we want to make, and here's how we want to make money on it. Here's, it might include, here's the technology we want to use. It might, in the case when I was making games for PlayStation, it's like, well, your job is to make people excited about buying PlayStations. Your job is to sell hardware.
I like that though, because it's
Right?
to make people excited. And,
Yes.
and I guess that's the crux, isn't it? There's been a shift in how do you make people excited.
That's right. And what are you making them excited to do?
Exactly.
Or if you even need them to be excited. Because notice a lot of this stuff, you don't need them to be excited. You just need them to feel frustrated. Right? I mean,
Or to feel like they can make money.
But frustration without excitement just means I go to another game, because there are millions of games out there and there's a lot of competition. So if I'm frustrated and I'm not excited, then I will just quit the game and I'll never come back.
unless I've invested tons of money into the game potentially, though maybe the investment is still there. You just stop playing. I guess that's another possibility.
Yeah. You just stop playing. You just like, there's another game. There's always going to be another game. There's a brand new game that I'm also excited about. I'll just shift my attention over. And you're right. It's all about attention. As for like I'm trying to wrap my head around this as a model, right? As a business model, because I do think that it's okay for people to make money making games. And a business model is just a business model. Whether I'm enticing people to put quarters into a slot, or whether I'm and making the game extra difficult at certain levels to make sure enough people die at that level that they want to put another quarter in the slot. That's not that dissimilar from, like tuning the difficulty of a free to play game to catch somebody who's willing to pay me $1, 99 cents for a golden eagle. Yeah, Angry Birds, right? It's not that dissimilar to me, and I think that these things can be done artfully, and they can be done in such a way as to not be disenchanting. And Sturgeon's law applies, right? That 90% of everything is shit.
Yep.
And there's thousands of games. Hundreds of them are very, very good.
And thousands of them are very, very bad.
And many thousands of them are very bad.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, though, I feel the moral panic for this NFT, Web3. Like, I can't figure out how this works. I don't understand why people are putting money into this. I can't understand how they're expecting to make all of this money back, because there's a lot of money going in. And their pitch doesn't seem to include money coming back out to them. And
to the companies or
to the
players? Company
that makes this decentralized autonomous organization. That's another one of their acronyms, DAO. Like, why would a company build something like that to where they give up control and they give up profits? So is it a lie then? Is all of this promise a lie?
In a way, I think there is cloak and dagger, yes. In the sense that, like, the idea that this is autonomous and the use of words like that are a little bit misleading. Because ultimately, like you pointed out earlier, there is a difference here between the way, say, the stock market works and the way this works, in that there's always going to be a small slice going back to a non-autonomous entity. It's going back to effectively what we could call, a game developer in charge of a particular game world is effectively, I think, with the creation of these NFTs, almost akin to a sovereign state, a sovereign nation state, who has control over a market, but they are allowing that market to interface with other nation states' markets too, but they're still taking slices back. So if you think about it like that, I mean, the analogy doesn't work perfectly, but the idea is there, I suppose. I could probably hash that out a lot better, but that idea of it being still there being this very top level powerful entity that does keep getting slices back. And I think if you add into the mix this idea that we've talked about already, that the amount of attention and activity that this could generate on a scale that up on a massive level, those little slices being taken from each exchange is potentially worth billions, because they can attract a lot of players to this style of gaming by saying everyone makes money here, But the simple fact is I'm the one that's going to be making the real money. You're going to have to put loads of time and effort in order to even make something akin to a living, or even just if it's a side hustle, you're going to have to put in a lot of time and effort to learn the game, be the best at the game, and generate a lot of these in-game items that when you sell them, we just take a little bit of the cream off the top. You know, like that whole idea is where I think you're getting at. I think for me, it is a bit of a lie. There is a bit of cloak and dagger there, you know?
And they can't possibly pay me enough to make it worth my time, right? I mean, I could play a game, or I could get a job at McDonald's, and which is going to pay better?
Well, I guess that question, get a job at McDonald's or play the game is a question not so much of how much money you could potentially earn from it, because that is misleading. And I think that's where companies could mislead people by saying, take a look at Andy here. He earned $25,000 last month trading his NFTs from a video game, right? As a critical political economist, I'll be sitting there asking, how much time did he invest? Are all of those NFTs that he sold last month simply only from his activity of the previous month? You know, there's a lot of things that aren't being said here in this case study that you're presenting me with. Yeah. Whereas, go to McDonald's, I know what your hourly salary is. I know that you're earning enough to make a living, and I know that also, you know, as an entity, even though it's working for McDonald's, it's still you're an employee. Therefore, there are certain things about your job that are actually not necessarily stable. It is quite precarious in a lot of its own ways, but it's something that's regular and actually regulated as well. And right. I am a little bit of a believer in regulation when it comes to things like people's working lives, because I think it is absolutely important. And trying to sell this kind of stuff, you know, playing games to earn money as a way to make a living is quite a dangerous statement to make. Ethically, I think it's actually quite questionable, because ultimately you're trying to sell people the idea of stability. And actually, we know that, you know, the volatility of cryptocurrencies is a big note that I've got on my screen from when I was making some notes on some of the questions you wanted to ask. You know, this is very volatile. You know, it is very volatile. And, you know, the amount of time and effort required to invest in this, both investment of time and investment of money, could potentially be huge, you know?
I want to jump back to a couple of the things you said, but especially this idea that, look, on the one hand, it just seems to me that the idea of making money while you play, if you play the same way, sounds awesome, right?
Yeah, it does.
But money's a big motivator. And if now that motivator is going to be sold to us as, you know, hey, and you can make more money if you keep doing this, and now it becomes work, right? Now essentially you're working, and now comes the real question of what you're really getting for your time and your labor. Because I think one thing that was missing from the way you mentioned it before was that if you're just playing the game, there's also the fun part, right? Which you're not getting when you're working at McDonald's, right? Except for the fun of enjoying your coworkers maybe, or something like that. And that's really the attraction, right? Not necessarily that you'll make more, but that you'll enjoy it, right? But to me, the really big issue is, fair enough, that's possible, but are you deceiving people in how this is going to work? And I thought the example you gave was very good, but my first thing I was thinking as a critical thinking instructor is, that's an anecdote of a sample of one, right? And you're right, and you're definitely right about this additional information that needs to be given about this particular sample, right? It's really, really, because if you're giving it without that additional information, you mean
the case study example I sort of thought up of this person that's made this much money this month? Yeah, exactly, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, how much did they put in? How much of it came from this month? What did they do? I think all that stuff is super important, along with, and what happened to the other 1,000 people who try to do something like this?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And therein lies what I think is the rub, is that this is being sold as an opportunity for everybody, right? But also that it's win-win for everybody. And we know that there are winners and losers always.
Right.
Right.
So nobody puts a lot of investment into win-win situations.
No, because there's no such thing really. You know,
wait. Can I ask about that? Because, all right, you know, I know capitalism is not necessarily popular right now among many people, but isn't the idea of capitalism that increased transactions essentially increase trade. Yeah, there are going to be some people who are going to make more than others, but overall, that this is going to raise everybody up. Isn't that kind of the idea? Winners and losers, yes,
but
you know.
it requires there to be something to feed off of, right? And in this case, what they're feeding off of is people's time when they play games. So if you think about it like a commons, the commons is there's all this time that people are putting into games. Let's see if we can make some money off of it, and then we'll share some of that money with the people who are playing the games.
So we have labor that's not being used.
Right.
And, that labor is sometimes creating things that are, valuable to others, right? Like,
Right.
let's say.
And there's a risk always with this, right? What is it doing to the commons?
I do think that there are people who get completely lost or completely overlooked, or necessarily people who are, completely marginalized or even outright exploited in certain cases where there's no benefit here to them to be in this position. And I think, I always think of good examples where we've talked before about, satisfaction in work, right? And it's a really funny one, satisfaction at work, when you think about the history of say, capitalist development and the modern current iteration that we have. And you think about the way it's global now, right? And I think to myself, where does a lot of the materials that go into the building of my iPhone come from? And we know that child labor, in mines in sub-Saharan Africa is a real thing, and that there isn't really much of a benefit to those people to be doing that job, because their life expectancy is reduced, to early 20s, mid 30s at best. And to us, from the standard, the position we sit in, we think to ourselves, is that sort of raising everybody up slowly, but some people are right at the top and some people are a bit further down? I kind of argue that there's more of a polarizing effect happening, where there are people who are completely downtrodden in some cases. And I mean, I haven't seen it myself firsthand, but I know of it. But I think sort of taking that and asking ourselves, is there exploitation necessarily going to be happening here with the NFTs and video gaming? I think that like many things, it has the potential to be. And the critical thing really ultimately is coming back to the catch line that we've come back to over and over again, is, everybody wins here, which I think from an ethical point of view and from a sort of a sociological and a political economic point of view, like I said, it is a bit cloak and daggery, because ultimately what's being sold there is there's two things colliding with one another. The ability to make money combined with a certain supposed new form of freedom. And if money making and freedom love each other, they've been in a love relationship for many hundreds of years now. The idea that you can freely make money yourself is absolutely essential. I mean, America is a country built on that ideal, that you could go to the Americas, to the New World, and make your destiny, forge your destiny. That kind of idea of frontierism, I guess you could call it. I'm probably going to end up, whenever I write stuff about this, I'm going to end up using loads of terms that are derived from gold rush studies, like frontierism, because this is a frontier, at the end of the day.
And frontiers do promise freedom. I mean, that's really,
absolutely
right.
Absolutely. But freedom to make your fortune. And it just so happens that in the modern world, make your fortune or make your destiny is almost entirely synonymous with make a shitload of cash, right? I mean, that's pretty much what it is. I mean, I'd be really interested if anyone anywhere has done a historical study of the sort of the social attitudinal changes towards the meaning of what it means to be fortunate and to make a fortune or to forge your fortune. Because I suspect that a few hundred years ago, the word fortune wasn't quite as monetarily inflected as it is now. But that's just me. I would love it if someone was listening to this show and they could actually point me in the direction of a book or something in that direction. But
well, there's the Roman goddess Fortuna, right?
Fortuna, yeah, exactly.
Right, which is the goddess of luck. So, right, fortune was really about luck rather than
money,
wealth, right? I mean, that which is kind of interesting how that word has
changed,
has changed
right.
along the way.
Tim, I think the word wealth has as well. The word wealth has changed a lot, I think, too, in that respect. But sorry, what were you going to say?
You also talked to us earlier about freedom in the context of how this whole thing, play to earn, is also sold as freeing in another sense, right? In another sense where you are freeing yourself from the monopoly that games have in terms of ownership. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really interesting one again, because the freedom to be able to own something, and like the freedom to basically have autonomy, really, at the end of the day, is that's what it is. The freedom to own these assets and autonomously, supposedly, through the cryptocurrency market, be able to buy, sell, and trade them. And that autonomy has always been a very powerful motivator for for sort of getting people into action to be venture capitalists, to be people who get involved in a particular market that's being set up. The idea of your freedom to do this is really, really strong. And I think you mentioned earlier the concept of the car, right? That is what the car is. The social ideology of the car is something that, when it came around, was effectively a technological device that you could buy to free yourself from the constraints of having to walk everywhere or be in a place where it takes multiple days to get somewhere else. And then eventually, it became a type of freedom that's so deeply embedded in our everyday lives that it goes unnoticed now, I suppose.
Let's talk about what you're actually buying when you buy an NFT. My understanding is that you're not buying much. You're basically buying, it's like the akin of buying a locker in a place that has a thing in it. But that thing could change. What gets put in that locker could be modified.
Are we talking specifically in relation to NFTs that are in-game items, or just NFTs more generally?
NFTs that are in-game items.
The one thing about in-game ones in particular is, using your locker analogy, is that you're buying a locker in a place, but that place is a very definite space that locker can only exist in. Once you pick that locker and take it up out of the door, or try and say, extract it from your CD-ROM drive, it just disappears. Right? It's a locker with whatever's inside, and I think it's a bit of an enigma of what's inside. Actually, I think a lot of people are still trying to figure that out. Is that it's not as movable and mutable as people think. It's not something that can be utilized everywhere. I think it's very interesting to think about the difference between the exchange value of what that locker is and the use value of what that locker is. And I think actually a really interesting thing that I've never thought about until just this point now in time is that when you're thinking about the use value of these in-game items, it's inherently tied to the game world in which it was created. As far as I can see, I know that there may be developments in the works that might change that, where you have a whole ecosystem of games where stuff can move between them. I don't know whether that will increase the integrity of these economies so that they're a bit more stable. I don't know.
On the development side, it would take a lot to make developers build to some sort of common standards that would allow things to be moved from one thing to another. It would take a lot of effort.
On a sort of theoretical point of view, for me at least, as someone that's interested in how capitalist practice works and markets work, that would require cooperation between competitors, right? Which is something that doesn't happen often.
Right. And I can tell a slight story. I was working on I was working at Disney as a freelancer, and I was working on Tron, and I was working on a mobile game for Tron, and we pitched, and everybody loved the idea that this mobile game could look at the various servers that all the other Tron games, because Disney was making a variety of Tron games, and could give you things for the mobile game based on how well you did on the other games. And it wouldn't take much for these developers to give us access to.
It's the same company.
It's the same company. Yeah. It's the same company.
Did they like the idea?
They loved the idea. I could not make it happen.
Why not?
It's just difficult. It's just developmentally hard. Everybody's under pressures to get their games out the door. This is one little extra thing that they need to do, and it's just not going to happen. If it was, again, if it needed to be built from the game up, or from the bottom up, it had to be something that they had to know was going to be required of them from the very beginning.
Right, but can't you see a company like Activision
EA?
Blizzard or EA? Let's go with
Yeah.
EA, right? Saying,
Absolutely.
okay, we're jumping on this NFT bandwagon, and we're going to essentially make it so all our games kind of work in the same way, and you can exchange assets between our games. And
That's right.
all
Roblox
that.
does it.
Though they're a single, I don't know what you call that. They're a single
Well-
game world with games that all work the same. But you're right. I mean, in a sense.
Yeah. It's
but they,
kind of the same.
right. Though they don't have a bunch of different properties exactly. But
No, but stuff you build in one can be taken into the other. Avatars you build in one. People in this space, people sort of point at avatars as being sort of the main thing that people are going to really gravitate towards. I can have my avatar from this game moved into this game and play, so.
I want to come back to your locker metaphor there again, though, because I still feel like ultimately there's a bit of a disconnect here between the freedom that's kind of sold, that this is sort of sold on. I mean, part of it is everyone can make money, but also a part of it is you own this and this is yours. You can do whatever you like with it. That's one of the principles of, modern notions of private property ownership, right? Even from the ground up. But that it's like that private property that you own is still ultimately restricted by the commercial ownership of a particular space in which the use value of it is actually applicable. Whereas I think earlier, Shlomo, you said, a painting, I can go buy a painting, I can hang it anywhere I want.
right.
I can throw it in a skip. I can take it to my local park and hang it up on the goalposts if I really want to. I can reappropriate its use entirely if I really like. I can break it down and use the timber to light my fire, or I could, hang it up somewhere. There are many different things I can do with that, right? Because it's my private property once I've bought it. But the same isn't true for NFTs. And I guess one thing I'm interested in seeing actually is how is the issue of the use value of something that is an NFT going to be looked at, thought about, and addressed in the industry? That's an open question for me. And I'm always interested in how developers are going to think about that kind of thing, because ultimately, there could be people who are investors who aren't game players at all, and they would buy your locker and say, oh, I'm going to buy that locker. It belongs to a game world that's pretty stable. It's got a big player base. I'm going to look at all the metrics that have been gathered for these game worlds. And I do think, as a sort of a corollary statement, that the publicizing and publishing about how healthy games are metrically and in terms of measurement is going to become a really big standard if this stuff takes off.
Yeah.
That there'll almost be like a cryptocurrency market style level of kind of granular levels of detail that you can go into on game populations, player activity, and health and stuff that will be required for people who are outside of those games to actually have the confidence to invest.
So this is similar. So it's interesting because this is right now mostly proprietary information that people don't have. But just like companies on the stock exchange need to, publicize that information to keep confidence in their stock, you would have companies do the same thing in the game world.
And therein will come in a little bit of what you said earlier about potential deception. I mean, there is a lot of sort of various levels of deception that take place on the stock market, especially when you're trying to boost confidence, when you're trying to do this and that. My brother's really interested in cryptocurrency, and he knows a lot about it. And one thing he sort of repeatedly tells me that's really interesting to see is that you can look at any crypto wallet in the world, right? You can go away and you can look up the blockchain and you can see how much of a particular cryptocurrency is sitting in a particular wallet. You can never know who owns that wallet, but you can see how much of the cryptocurrency is in that wallet. And people who are really savvy with cryptocurrency trading keep a very close eye on the wallets that have very large amounts of the cryptocurrency in them, because they know as soon as crypto in those wallets starts shifting, the whole market's going to change, right? Which tells us something. That tells us, it doesn't tell us who, but it tells us that there is a form of power that lies somewhere. And the power is lying with those who have a very large amount of the accumulated value overall, because they have the power to basically, I guess in a way, like manipulate the market if they want, if they so wish. Sure. So, I mean, the question could be for someone who's really obsessed with it, who owns these? Because I would love to know. But for me, that's not really the ultimate ethical issue here. The ethical issue here is really ultimately that someone owns that much and therefore has the power to a lot more power over others, basically, who are in the same market, you know?
And I think the other ethical issue is that they're touting this space as being transparent, but here's this aspect of complete obscurity.
Absolutely. Yep. Exactly. You know, and that to me is all about what we've just been saying about the freedom that is being sold to you to do all of these things, to make money, to be able to buy and trade it because it's your own private property. But then actually there are still a lot of forms of control that you are not being told about here that you will be subjected to. And one is there are powerful players out there who can manipulate the market that you're going to potentially become a part of. So it's important to be aware of that. And the other one is that although you have the freedom to buy and sell this piece of private property as and when you wish, ultimately the value of that piece of property relies on almost like a concatenation of multiple things now, you know, like multi-level things on top of each other, one of which is the game world being healthy and still usable and still something that people actually want to go to. Because, you know, games are kind of, in a way, they're meant to grow and die. That's what games are. You know, that is what they are meant to do. They're meant to have a life cycle. At least I think so anyway. You know, they're meant to be...
We all want our games to become hobbies and become, you know, evergreen.
Yeah, exactly. But
very few do, right? Of course.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, on a longer time scale, most companies grow and eventually reach some kind of point where they decline. You know, it kind of happens. It's a cycle. But I mean, I'm not saying that's always the case, but it's making me think about how much will games still be games when if this kind of stuff becomes the standard practice is all I'm asking. It's in a way it's going to become a whole nother form of game. Because I mean, you'll have people basically, I mean, if let's think about a game where it's play to earn, and if it's a game that involves any kind of competition, there's going to be a whole load of people who don't want to get involved in that after it's been in existence for a few months. You know, basically people who are just not capable of competing. And that's actually quite a common phenomenon now as well, is that they call it the churn, I think, sometimes in the video games industry, where you do have a small core set of players who are really invested in the game and they've either developed their skills through the grind or they've bought lots of in-game stuff that makes them quite powerful or whatever. War Thunder that I play is a great example. And then there's a whole lot of players who play it for a little bit, realize that they don't stand a chance of competing once they get to a certain point and just move on.
Fail.
You know?
Yep.
Just move on.
Because there's always another game.
I mean, I think that's an ethical question as well, and a moral question about what are video game companies really trying to offer to players? Because when I did my research in the early and mid 2010s on free to play, one of the standard moral narratives that crops up a lot, and it is that when asked directly, why are you introducing the free to play model? Is it just to make money? One of the standard narrative answers you get is, it's not just to make money. We want to make money so that we can make a better experience for the players. You know, right. Ultimately, a lot of the ethical onus was placed on what we're really doing is providing a great experience here for players. And I wonder how much of that kind of ethic or that ethos of, well, ultimately making money is to make better games is actually true. it's quite hard to unpick.
I think it's very true until the company becomes public. My experience is that the pressures of being owned by, you know, having stock on the stock market and being owned by public investors, having shareholders, and quarterly reports is what distorts all of that. Being able to having this fiscal responsibility to make money for people who don't necessarily care about games or even know that they own a game company.
I really don't like shareholder economics, actually, by the way. Just as a personal opinion of mine, I think shareholder economics is one of the primary ways that a lot of creativity of what companies do gets disenchanted, actually. I think there's a lot to be said about that. But
that's been my experience, too.
Tom, what do you want to leave our listeners with?
Play games to enjoy them. Don't let the primary reason to play a game be something that's eventually going to become some kind of shackle. You know, just play it to enjoy it.
Fully agree.
All right. Tom Rodgers, thank you so much.
Yay! You're most welcome. Thank you for having me on. And it went on a lot longer than I thought, but I really enjoyed this discussion. I'll send my notes over as well. It was fantastic.
Right. Yeah. Right on. Play nice, everybody.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.